30 ring muscle-ups 4 times. That was event 2 of the 2018 CrossFit Games. For the field of women, 28 out of the 40 that were left and not cut were under the 5-minute time cap, and for the males, 100% were under that 5-minute cap. What this means is all the athletes were doing at least 6 reps every minute. In other words, 10 seconds per rep. That's dense work. In the sport of fitness, it's no longer good enough to complete high-level gymnastics. If you want to compete with the best, you have to be able to perform big sets under high fatigue. In other words, you need to build your gymnastics density capacity. To outline today's show, we got 4 different parts. Part 1 is quantifying gymnastics in CrossFit. So I have 5 different factors that I've kind of broken gymnastic density down into. I want to go through those 5. What are they? And then why are they important? So this is really about upgrading your language. And if we can upgrade your language, we'll upgrade your understanding of how to think about gymnastics density. And then in part 2, I want to go over how to troubleshoot gymnastics density for an athlete. And that's really coming down to 2 different questions. How is it tested in the sport? And then how do you assess an athlete's ability for it? So the sport and the athlete, those are always the 2 things that we have to balance. Part 3 is then building gymnastics density. So not protocols just yet. More so, I want to take you through the model that we're using at Zor Fitness to be able to help develop an athlete's ability for gymnastics density. And that's a 4-step process. I'll run down through that. And then we're going to apply that model onto sample training sessions. So I want to run through a bunch of different, in fact, 8 total training sessions that I've pulled from either my athletes or Gymnastics Density University. So let's get into part 1, quantifying gymnastics in CrossFit. So these are those 5 factors that I talked about. I think this is going to be easily explained if I just use an example workout and then apply those to each of those 5 factors. So the example workout I want to use is Open 20.2, which should be fairly recent in people's memory. It was a 20-minute AMRAP, 4 dumbbell thrusters, 6 toes to bar, 24 double unders. And let's just say this athlete, to make the math easy, did 20 rounds exactly of that workout. So 20-minute AMRAP, 6 toes to bar is really what we're focusing on here because of the gymnastics density. They did 20 rounds. Okay, let's get into the 5 factors. The first factor is density. So density is just coming down to cycle rate. So maybe the number of reps that someone's doing per minute, maybe the number of seconds it takes them to do for each rep across the workout as an average. So in this case, if we just use reps per minute, it's pretty simple. It was a 20-minute AMRAP. They did 20 rounds. Each of those rounds were 6 toes to bar. So their cycle speed in terms of reps per minute was 6. Quite simple. So that was density. Number 2 is chunking. So chunking is the number of reps that you're asked to do at a shot. So in other words, this could be like per round in this case, right? Where it was 6 reps per round. The reason I write it as at a shot versus saying per round is because if you have a chipper, you're not going through it multiple times. So it's just the number of reps of you're asked to do of a particular movement before you move on. So again, in this case, it would be 6 because you're asked to do 6 toes to bar per round. 3 is volume. So it's just the total of number of reps that you're doing. In a workout like this, it's an AMRAP, so you don't know exactly how many you're going to get, because if it was 20 rounds per time, you'd know you get exactly 120 reps, right? But since this person did exactly 20 rounds, that's exactly what it is. It's 20 rounds for 6 reps per round for 120 total reps as the volume that athlete accumulated. And then for factors 4 and 5, these are more qualitative in nature, where it's not necessarily going to be a number that gets spit out, but it's something that's still very important in understanding your capacity for gymnastics density. Number 4 is interference. We could just say this is high, moderate, or low interference. So basically, this is saying like the same muscle group is being taxed throughout the workout, or the same patterns are being hit in the workout. In this case, the interference is low. Like you're gripping in the toes to bar, you're gripping in the dumbbell thruster, you're gripping in the double unders, but none of those are super taxing. You get a lot of breaks. So I'd say that's relatively low. Yes, you're using quite a bit of the shoulder, more so tricep. So I'd say some relatively minor grip and tricep redundancy to create that interference effect. And then factor number 5 is fatigue. And obviously all the other aspects could be generating fatigue, all the other factors. However, here I'm talking about systemic fatigue, right? So being at a high respiration rate or a high heart rate for an extended period of time, and that's what's causing and driving a lot of the challenge in the workout to the gymnastics components. So again, here is just looking at, for this particular workout, I would say that fatigue is high. So your heart rate is going to climb fairly quickly at the beginning of the workout, and you have to hold that like right at your threshold that entire time, just kind of riding just under that red line for the entirety of that 20-minute time domain. It's a pretty long workout. So it feels like you're sort of like a dog chasing your tail the whole time. That was how a lot of people felt in 20.2. So those are the 5 factors: density, chunking, volume, interference, and fatigue. So now that we've standardized some of the language around gymnastics density, I want to go through 5 truths. And these are things that we'll have a better understanding of now because we've kind of, had this discussion about the language already. But these are 5 truths about gymnastics performance as it relates to CrossFit. And these things I don't think are very disputable. They're just kind of the nature of what's going on. And that's kind of what I meant to write them as. And it's sort of, again, another foundation for our conversation today. Truth number 1. Density is relative to volume. So this could also be said where pace is relative to duration. Those are sort of the same thing, right? And this is something that should be very intuitive to most athletes, even if they didn't understand what I was just saying. Like if you're rowing a time trial on the rower, you have a 250 versus a 1K versus a 2K, 5K versus 10K versus marathon, right? All of those are going to have a unique pace or work rate so that you can maximize your power output across that time domain. That's all I'm saying here, right? It could be said pace relative to duration. It could be said pace relative to volume, right? 1K row versus 10K row, or it could just be density relative to volume, right? It's all sort of the same. Fact number 2, or truth number 2, density is pattern specific. So for each pattern, but also each athlete, they're going to have unique pace in terms of the number of reps that they can hold per minute, aka density, that they can actually hold in each pattern. So an athlete's ring muscle up versus chest to bar versus toes to bar versus bar muscle up ability for density are all going to be different. In other words, they all have different maximal sustainable densities. Truth number 3, chunking and volume determine your break strategy. So break strategy is just simply how you attack a chunk of work. So if a workout is 3 rounds for time of a 30 calorie row and 30 toes to bar, the chunk again is 30. How are you going to break that? Your break strategy might be you just do 1 set, right? Do the 30, move on. It's unbroken, right? Or it could be that you do 18-12. It could be that you do 10-10-10 or 11-10-9, right? That is your break strategy. That's how you're thinking about that. So your chunking in the volume of the workout is what's going to determine that break strategy. So if you have really big chunks of work, you're probably going to have to break that up more. Truth number 4 is the higher the interference, the lower the density. I think this one's probably most easily explained if I just use an example here. So 3 rounds for time, let's say it's a 400-meter run and 20 strict handstand push-ups. Those are non-interfering movements. They're kind of complementary movement patterns, if you will, where during the run, you're using mainly legs. During the strict handstand push-ups, you're using mainly arms. So those are relatively low interfering. You're going to be able to go faster as a result. Versus if we take that run and we turn it into a 400-meter ski, all of a sudden now it's an upper body movement that you're going to be using a lot of tricep in the skiing. Another upper body movement with the strict handstand push-ups, again, where the triceps are going to get really fatigued. So all of a sudden, now the density of those handstand push-ups that you're going to be able to maintain is going to go down as a result. So again, the higher the interference, the lower the density. And then our last truth is the more fatigue, the more technical breakdown. So this should be pretty intuitive like most of these have been. We just need to understand that as you get tired, you're going to have more compensatory movement patterns. So in other words, you're going to have to change the way that you do a movement as muscle groups fatigue and as you're just having more high systemic fatigue, right? So if you have diaphragmatic fatigue, if you have local fatigue in your lats, for example, when you're trying to do chest to bar, that movement's going to start to break down where your kip can't be as refined, your pulling mechanics can't be as smooth, right? And as a result, your efficiency is going to drop, and that's going to make the movement harder. while you're also getting more and more tired while doing it, which is a perfect recipe for you getting more sloppy towards the end of workouts and there being a bigger performance gap between the people who are sort of intermediate advanced to the elite world-class athletes, which is the goal in a lot of these tests. So let's run back through these 5 truths one more time. 1, density is relative to volume. 2, density is pattern specific. 3, chunking and volume determine your break strategy. 4, the higher the interference, the lower the density. And 5, the more fatigue, the more technical breakdown. All right, let's get into part 2. So this is troubleshooting gymnastics density. So in other words, if I have an athlete, they come to me, they're like, hey coach, I did really poorly in this workout relative to what I thought I could hold. This is what happened. That particular gymnastics movement broke down. What do we think we can do to improve it? Or they're just not performing where they could in a particular gymnastics movement. How do you go about improving that? What's your testing process look like? That whole process, right? That's what we're talking about here. Again, there's 2 questions that I like to think about and hold in my mind during a conversation like this with an athlete. How is the movement tested in the sport, or whatever quality is tested in the sport? And then how do you assess that particular athlete's ability to do that movement or that quality? So let's talk about how is it tested in the sport. First things first, what is the functional volume? That's one thing that you have to answer. I think functional volume has been getting talked about a lot, which I think is a good thing. However, there's also some misinformation that comes along with that kind of naturally. One of the things I think is being missed in the conversation a lot of the times is that functional volume is dependent on the gender of the athlete, the age group of the athlete, the competition that they're preparing for. So functional volume for the open versus quarterfinals versus games are all different, and the ability level of the athlete, right? So again, if we have a 20-minute AMRAP and we have an athlete who is a games level athlete versus a intermediate level athlete, they might do twice the volume of that other athlete, right? It really just kind of comes down to what is the level of that athlete as well when we're talking about functional volume. So the other thing is that functional volume is looking at the past, right? It's a sort of a post-game analysis. We're looking what has happened in the past so we can have a pretty good idea of being able to predict the future and have clues as to what might happen. However, no one really knows the functional volume of a new competition that comes out that has never been done before, right? You can certainly go back and maybe look at other things in the past and see what programming themes have come up, etc., but you don't really know for 100%. So basically, you just have to get a really good rough estimate based on what other aspects of the sport you can tell, and prepare the athlete for that. So that's functional volume. 2 would be then again, thinking about the ability level of other athletes that are in a similar sort of bucket as the athlete that you're talking about and having this discussion with. So if I'm talking to an open level athlete versus a quarterfinals versus a games level athlete, again, what are other athletes in that same demographic able to hold in a particular version of a workout and a particular movement, right? So again, if I know, for example, that a lot of the male games level athletes in 2018 did 30 ring muscle ups per time in sub 2, or many of them did sub 3 minutes on that test, and then I have a pretty good idea that, hey, if you want to qualify for the games, you should probably be able to do 30 ring muscle ups per time in sub 3 minutes on long straps with a little run afterwards, right? Things like that, where you can start to compare and get an idea of what you need. Another thing that I would think about is what movement pairings are really going to be commonly tested, right? And that allows you to start to troubleshoot, do specific combos that this is something that is limiting you. For example, if you do have muscle ups, what are muscle ups most commonly paired with, right? If it's like an open setting, it could be muscle ups and double unders, muscle ups and snatches, muscle ups and wall balls, right? Those things are all super commonly paired together. Or if you have chest to bars, thrusters, right? Thrusters are paired all the time with those. So that's one of the things that you really need to look at. So then we're going to take the knowledge that we had in that first part and we're going to apply it to the individual athlete. So looking at the athlete's ability for gymnastics density. For this, really, I want to start very basic. Let's look at the athlete's frame. Let's look at their body weight and body fat. So, if they're a 230-pound male, you're going to have a hard time doing a lot of the hanging gymnastics and accumulating the amount of volume that you need to be able to compete at a high level. If you are a female and you have a body fat percentage of 26, right? It's above the range that's necessary to be healthy and to be able to recover well and all the other things that are associated with a necessary amount of body fat. And above that, it's just added weight, right? There's no contractile potential in that tissue. And as a result, it's just dead weight. There's a reason why athletes are lean at the best at the CrossFit Games, right? It's not just that they're working out a lot, because strongmen, open water swimmers, and some of those type of sports, they train a ton, and yet they are not lean, right? And it's just demands of the sport as well. So we need to think about body weight and body fat percentage. We need to think about their individual anthropometrics. So this is something that actually came up in the conversation that I had with Chris Hardenberg in episode 43, where we talked about troubleshooting the squat and how things like leg length and femur length, torso length, all these things, like the individual body parts and the segments of the body, how are those impacting the movement, right? So if practically, again, if we use the example of chest to bars, we have an athlete, they have really long limbs, like their wingspan is greater than their height, for example. It's going to make chest to bars more difficult. It's going to make strict handstand push-ups more difficult. It's just going to make a lot of those hanging gymnastics more difficult. So these are the things we can begin to look at, right? It's not an excuse for the athlete. However, it's something that is a reality that we need to check and make sure we understand. The next thing I would go to is that athlete's backgrounds, maybe their athletic history, right? What have you been doing prior to us working together to understand what kind of clues can that lead me into what is impacting your performance? So for example, I have an athlete and they were a swimmer. Chances are they have a pretty good pull, like they have decent lat strength. They can coordinate like proximal to distal pulling mechanics, right? And be able to tie in their core as they do that. And they're probably a little bit more, have an enduring pull as well. Versus if we have an athlete and maybe they're a field sport athlete and they're more on the power end of the spectrum, they might not have the muscle mass that's necessary for the upper body to be able to do the exercises, or they just don't have the coordination and the shoulder girdle strength and all the other qualities that are necessary to be able to produce dense work down the road. So maybe we just need to take a step back and look at what's your strict strength, some of those factors like that. Next, I would just ask the athlete, like I'm saying it's an athlete self-assessment, but practically it's just like ask the athlete like, hey, what do you think is like slowing you down in these types of workouts? For example, hey, in this Metcon, I did not do as well as I wanted to. The chest to bars really limited me. I think it was because like after I got off the thrusters, like my heart rate was just so high that I felt like I couldn't recover. And normally if I'm pretty fresh, I feel like I can bang out sets of like 12 to 15 pretty consistently on chest to bar, but I was reduced to like, triples and fives for the most part, just because I was so tired. Things like that can give you a lot of clues into what's going on with an athlete's physiology and also their headspace during a workout like that. And the last thing I would do is go to the leaderboards, right? Just get some data collection off those leaderboards to be able to see objectively, because the athlete's opinion is subjective, objectively, where are they sitting in specific workouts relative to the field? The open's great because there's a huge leaderboard. You can go on there and say like, okay, in all the chest to bar workouts that you've done over the last 5 years, what are some of the themes and the ones that you finished the best in versus finished the worst in, right? What was kind of going on with that person during that time? What qualities were challenged the most? Oh, look, every time that is paired with a high power movement, you tend not to do as well because you're fatigued going into those chest to bars. Okay, so maybe we need to run some progressions, being able to maintain our skill under fatigue for chest to bars and be able to handle bigger chunks under fatigue. Things like that, right? That's really how I would go about sort of troubleshooting an athlete's ability for a specific quality of gymnastics density. So we've just had a conversation with an athlete, figuring out what specific thing potentially could be limiting their performance, whether it's a movement, whether it's a quality of their gymnastics performance. Now, how do we actually go about improving that? Let's talk about part 3, building gymnastics density. At Zor Fitness, we've created a model of how to improve someone's gymnastics density or just developing gymnastics as a whole. It's a 4-step model. Let's go over them quickly and then I'll go through a more detailed breakdown. Step number 1 is building strict strength, and doing that in combination with also developing an athlete's muscular endurance. Step number 2 is a volume build and pattern refinement. Those two are being coupled together. Step number 3 is either building upon interference, density, chunking, or making movements more fatigue resistant. And then number 4 is building the actual capacity for the sport. So it's sport work. Let's run back through these in a little bit more detail. So first thing we need to understand is this model is not a linear model. So in other words, when you move from step 1 to step 2, it does not mean that you stop doing step 1. So for example, if you're building strict strength, it doesn't mean that you need to, as you prep for competition, do no strict strength work. Again, this is athlete dependent, right? But you probably want to keep touches on all the other steps as you move through this, but you want one step to be the focal point of that, right? So in step 1, we're focused on developing strict strength, but that also means that we could probably still continue to do touches of interval work or metcons that have kipping work in it, for example. So basically, when you get to step 4, you're not going to completely neglect step 1 or step 2. Step number 1, again, this is strict strength, muscular endurance work. Some people get confused as to why I would pair those two together. I actually really like that spectrum approach is what we call it. It's basically sort of an ends to middle take on it. That works really well because as you're developing an athlete's ability to produce high levels of force and high contractile strength, that doesn't translate super well into just doing metcons where you're under a lot of fatigue and respiratory distress, unless you've also paired that with some muscular endurance work, right? And I think people can get hung up on that, but honestly, it's pretty simple and it works really well. So for example, let's say there's a session and the athlete does it's 5x5 weighted strict pull-up, for example. After that session or towards the end of that session, we might just have them do some low threshold ski intervals, right? Where you're still accumulating some work, right? It's still working that upper body. It's getting the tricep, it's hitting the lat, right? Where you're getting a lot of continual contractions, lower tension contractions, where we can, again, start to still maintain some of the qualities that we need to be successful at the sport, right? Again, it's not saying that we're never doing metcons throughout the week. It's not saying we're not, neglecting other aspects, but during that time, we're focused on driving the strict strength and probably having that athlete get a little bit more healthy as well. This is something that'll give a lot during deloads, during off season, or like post off season, like as they're building back into training again, just to, minimize joint wear and tear, make sure that the athlete's staying resilient, making sure that they maintain, again, a quality and a base that's necessary for them to build moving forward. So that's why we start with strict strength and muscular endurance. Next would be the volume build and pattern refinement. Again, I think a lot of people think that these things are kind of odd to pair together, to pair like skill work with building volume, but I think those two pair perfectly together. Reason being, while you're building volume, you're not also trying to build density. You're not also trying to build big chunking or adding a ton of interference into it, right? The goal is to build the volume and to do that in a way that the athlete can tolerate it. And they will tolerate volume building best when they do it with less fatigue and they do it with a high intention and the best quality reps that they can. So the goal here is really to build quality movement. Say we have an athlete and they can hit 3 bar muscle ups as their rep max. It's like, great. Can you hit doubles consistently? Okay, let's just build on doing that. Maybe every 90 seconds you hit 2 bar muscle ups, or every 2 minutes you hit 2 bar muscle ups, and you start and it's 4 sets, and then you build it to 6, 8, 10. You just continue to build that. And the whole time it's like, hey, focus on the quality of these movements. Make sure that these are the cleanest you possibly can, like no chicken wing, no sloppy kipping, right? Making sure that everything is, pretty, right? Making sure that things look good. And as a result, that's only going to improve the athlete's ability to make that movement fatigue resistant and to minimize the joint wear and tear that they're getting as they build that volume, because that can be definitely a stressful time in terms of physiological what's going on. Make sure that they can handle that as best they possibly can. I would say the goal here is to build that volume to probably slightly past what's functional for that athlete. So slightly past the functional volume. And then that's going to really allow that athlete to build some tissue tolerance where they can handle higher volumes in workouts, and allows them to build, again, quality reps and a lower fatigued environment and with lower densities, lower chunkings, lower intensities as a whole. Just the focus should be the focus, right? Allow the volume build and the skill work to slowly accumulate and have that athlete end where they need to be ending. Step number 3 is to improve one of the 4 qualities of gymnastics density for a specific movement or for a category of movements. So it's either going to be interference or density or chunking or fatigue. So my advice would be like pick 1, maybe 2 of those qualities to focus on. Don't try to improve all 4 at once because you're probably not going to do it. So basically pick one specific aspect of that interference, density, chunking, or fatigue, and then figure out how to run a progression where you're getting progressively harder and harder, pieces to basically challenge that aspect of the movement. And then lastly, again, as I said, is just mix it into the sport. This is Metcons structured in a way that, is very similar to the testing body of the sport and is executed at a high effort where the goal is to get the best possible time or score, right? The goal is for this to be performance oriented. Another thing that I want to touch on is the importance of balancing structure and variety. Basically, as you're running one of those progressions, right, what one of the 4 qualities that you're trying to improve there. For athletes that are more novice or maybe intermediate, it's important that you give them a lot of structure, basically giving them sort of the exact same progression with a little bit more reps or a little bit more fatigue or some aspect of that progression tweaked, but it's very similar week over week where it allows them to get consistent exposures of that same movement so that they can learn that skill. Right? It's very important so that they can actually refine that movement. That's what you want to do for the best motor learning for that athlete. As we get for a more advanced athlete, this is where you can start to incorporate a lot more variety into their training, and that's going to help them to be able to pace workouts by feel. So basically, you might, instead of just giving them, a progression of chest to bar, you might be able to switch all kinds of hanging gymnastics in there instead of just chest to bar, but focusing on one of the qualities. So for example, we're going to be working on getting you a little bit tired and then doing a bigger set of a hanging gymnastics movement, right? So it could be like, okay, we're going to get you on the assault bike and get your heart rate up and make sure that you're a little bit fatigued. And then we're going to have you do a big set of chest bar. Or we're going to have you doing rowing and bar facing burpees to get a little bit of fatigue driven in the system. And then we're going to have you do ring muscle ups, right? And you could run a sort of an A-linear progression like that for an athlete. And I think that'd be very appropriate for a more advanced athlete who needs a little bit more variety. I'll also say for an elite athlete, so this is someone who's at the pinnacle of the sport, they're a world-class athlete, they're actually going to go back to needing more structure again, right? So this athlete, they've already developed all the skills that they need, and they've already kind of raised the ceiling on like basically every aspect of their physical performance that's necessary for them to the highest degree possible. So if you want to drive anything up in terms of a quality higher, you're going to be needing to be very targeted in how you go about that, right? Like random doses of things aren't going to get them better because likely they've already done a lot of doses of everything because they've probably had quite a bit of training age already. Yeah, it takes some time to get good in CrossFit. Like you can't just rise up and be at a really high level very quickly. Like it's going to take years of development. So they've already had that development. So to push that up higher, you're going to need a more structured program again, even as an elite athlete. So I think of it sort of as like a bookends as you get closer to like more beginner and really high level above just like an average good competitor. Like if you're an elite athlete, both of those demographics are going to need more structure in the programming to improve specific quality, that is. For that higher level athlete, you're going to need that more consistent exposures to a variety of movements so that you can start to refine and ultimately just learn, as I said before, to pace workouts by feel, right? Because if you've never done a workout before, you might be able to strategize and get a pretty good idea, but ultimately, like you don't really know how it's going to feel until you get into it. And you have to know, when I feel like this is how many reps I can bang out, right? Like those sorts of intangibles, and be able to kind of take advantage of sort of the CrossFit chaos, we might call it. Let's get into some sample training sessions. So I'm going to give 2 examples for each of the 4 qualities. So again, the 4 qualities that we could be trying to improve: interference, density, chunking, and fatigue. So I'm going to give 2 examples that could be improving or aiming to improve each of those 4 qualities. Interference. The first session, that is an example. This comes from Gymnastics Density University. I straight up copy and pasted out of the program. Each of these are going to have a warm up and a cool down and some mobility work or flush work, for example, after this. However, this is the bulk of that day's work that is stressful. So the workout, you're going to ski 1K at an easy pace, immediately into a 6-minute AMRAP of 1 legless rope climb to 15 feet and a 25-foot handstand walk. Immediately into a 1K ski at an easy pace. Immediately into a 6-minute AMRAP of 3 rope climbs, just regular rope climbs now, and 6 handstand push-ups to a 3.5 or 2-inch deficit for males and females. Immediately into a 1K ski at an easy pace. So basically we got 2 6-minute AMRAPs, and in between and after each of those is a 1K ski at an easy pace. So obviously Skiing is taxing the same muscle groups that you're going to need for a rope climb to be able to compress your core like that, and for a handstand walk or handstand push-up with the triceps. So it's taxing those same muscle groups, but it's an easy pace, so it allows you to actually flush and clear some of that fatigue out of the local muscle as you're moving through that. And then the goal is to be able to produce some good high-quality work in those relatively short AMRAPs in between. So that's our first interference session. And then our second sample session for interference is the name game, one of the workouts from that. Those of you who aren't familiar, the name game is our Saturday sport programming. This particular workout was called Marry Me. It was a 15-minute AMRAP of 5 strict handstand push-ups, 8 pistols, and 13 toes to bar. So really, obviously, all of those are gymnastics movements. However, the pistols and the toes to bar, both of those are requiring a lot of hip flexion. Yeah, pistols are kind of requiring the maintenance of that, holding one foot off the floor, and the toes to bar, obviously, it's an active hip flexion where you're compressing your body that way. So really, that's where the big chunk of that interference is coming into play. Okay, let's move on to our density sample sessions. Our first one comes from Gymnastics Density University. There's a warm-up. I'm going to skip that. The bulk of the work, it's a running clock, and you're going to be performing at 0, at 4, and at 8 minutes on that clock. So at 0 minutes on the clock, for time, 15 kipping handstand push-ups to a 6 or 4-inch deficit. At 4 minutes, for time, 20 strict handstand push-ups. At 8 minutes, for time, 25 kipping handstand push-ups. Rest as needed, and then you're going to move into the first for time piece. For time, 60 GHD sit-ups. On the minute, including 0, 0, 0, you're going to be doing a 25-foot handstand walk. So at the very start, at 1, 0, 0, 2, 0, 0, each of those minutes, you're doing a 25-foot handstand walk. You'll rest exactly 4 minutes, and then it flips. So for time, it's a 150-foot handstand walk. And on the minute, including 0, 0, 0, you're going to be doing 8 GHD sit-ups. Rest as needed, and then you're skiing 3K at a nasal cap. So a nasal cap just means that you have to breathe through your nose. If you go any faster than that and you can't breathe through your nose, that means that's where you're stopping yourself, right? So you're staying under that threshold to make sure that you can breathe through your nose the entire time. And then our second density session is from my one-on-one client, Eric. It's 2 sets, so just remember that all this work is being completed twice. It's 3 rounds for time, 6 bar muscle ups, 9 calorie row, rest 3 minutes, 3 rounds for time, 2 rope climbs to 15 feet, 15 GHDs, rest 3 minutes. And then obviously it's 2 sets, you're going to complete that again. The interesting thing about these types of workouts is that you really have to be careful about how you give the volume, because again, it's 3 rounds, but it's 2 sets of that. So we have to multiply everything that you give by 6 in this case. If it was 3 sets, you have to multiply it by 9, right? So it gets exponentially more volume depending how you write that with those multiple sets and the rounds for time. So you just need to be careful if you program that type of work. But in this case, it was appropriate for that athlete and the volume that he was at that particular time. Let's move on to chunking. So this is a session from Rachel, who's one of my clients. It was 4 sets, 16 heavy wall balls, immediately into 4.4.4.4 toes to bar. So basically it was 16 heavy wall balls, 16 toes to bar, but I want her to break the toes to bar 4, 4, 4, 4, right? So I'm basically prescribing how she's going to go about her break strategy here. She's going to rest 2 to 3 minutes, and then she's going to repeat that for 4 total sets. And then our second chunking sample is actually one that I did recently in my own program, so I threw this one in. It was 4 sets of a 400-meter hill run, immediately into 12 unbroken ring muscle ups, and then rest 3 minutes between. I was basically walking back down the hill. So those were 2 very similar workouts in terms of structure. Like you can see, they're both 4 sets. They both have something that gets the athlete tired, and then a challenging sets of whatever gymnastics quality that you're trying to challenge. So these don't have to be big, long, complicated sessions. They can be something that's very simple, like, hey, if you're struggling with, holding bigger sets under fatigue, like, hey, let's just challenge that quality and then progress it week over week. Now, fatigue-based sessions. So again, this is systemic fatigue. So we're trying to get the athlete's heart rate and breathing up and elevated for an extended period of time as they're doing their gymnastics work. So our first fatigue-based session comes from Gymnastics Density University. For time, and so it's going to be 14, 14, 12, 12, 10, 10. So 3 rounds, but it's descending in that way. chest to bar, and box jump overs. You'll rest 1 to 1. So if it took you 4 minutes, you'll rest exactly 4 minutes. And then it's 4 time, again, 14, 14, 12, 12, 10, 10. Again, chest to bar, but now burpee to a 6-inch target. Rest 1 to 1. And then 4 time, again, 14, 14, 12, 12, 10, 10. Again, chest to bar, but now a dumbbell hang clean and jerk. So you can see this is obviously challenging an athlete in terms of their fatigue systemically, but it's also something that mimics the sport very closely as well. So this is something that would be great as you prep for competition, as you get a little bit closer to your competitive season. Something like that would be very appropriate. Our second fatigue-based session comes from Bart, who is one of my one-on-one clients. It was 8 sets of a 21-calorie air bike, immediately into 10 to 12 unbroken chest to bars. You rest to 8 out of 10 recovery between those sets. And for the air bike, it had to be from 0 to 7 calories. It was 300 watts. From 8 to 14 calories was 400 watts. And from 15 to 21 calories was 500 plus watts. So make sure you're holding over 500. So it's basically a ramping air bike into a set of unbroken chest bars to challenge that pattern as it's under fatigue. So I know I threw a lot at you today. Please do not get paralysis by analysis. I want this to be something that is actionable. So I would encourage everyone listening to go through 3 steps following this podcast. Number 1 is to choose a specific gymnastics movement, one that you find particularly challenging. And then 2, specify a quality of that movement that you would really like to improve the most, whether be it density, chunking, volume tolerance, fatigue resistance. And then 3 is to construct workouts that challenge that specific quality in a progressively more challenging way. So just create a basic progression of things that you can actually challenge that specific quality of the movement that is challenging for you. And ultimately, that is how you build your gymnastics density capacity.